history of the seventh dwarf ring. By seventh dwarf ring, I'm assuming you mean the ring of Thror, the one that was owned by, well, Thror, Thorin Oakenshield's grandfather. I will tell you what little there actually is to know about it. Like all the rings of power bar the one, this ring was made by Celebrimbor, the elf of Eregion, and it was made for use by elves. So the rings that would become known as the Dwarven rings and the rings of men, the 9 and the 7, were originally just part of 16 rings that were made by elves to be used by elves. According to Dwarven tradition, this ring was given to Durin III, king of Khazad-dûm, by Celebrimbor himself. However, I think that's actually kind of unlikely to have been what happened, for two reasons. Celebrimbor was very close with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. They had a great relationship. Khazad-dûm's location is even in part why Celebrimbor decided to found Ostinediol and Eregion where he did, because it was close to Khazad-dûm. There was a lot of trade between the two. They were peoples that were smiths and into jewelry and making shit and all that. They got on great. To the point that the doors of Durin, the doors that the Fellowship went through, were co-made by Celebrimbor alongside the dwarf Na'vi. So you can see why it could be believed that Celebrimbor gave a ring to Durin himself. But all the rings of power, as I say, were made by elves for use by elves. The very reason that the 16 and then later the 3 were created was to help for the protection and, most importantly, the preservation of elves and elven lands in Middle-earth, to stop the fading. The fading is the reason why at the time of Lord of the Rings, elves are leaving Middle-earth to go west to Aman, because if they stay in Middle-earth, they will fade. And this is caused by something called the Morgoth element, and basically the rings of power were made to counteract the effects of the Morgoth element. I won't go too deeply into the Morgoth element here, it definitely deserves its own video. Therefore, it seems unlikely to me that while the rings of power have been specially created for this very important task, Celebrimbor would have given them away to, well, someone who wasn't an elf and therefore didn't need them. The other reason is simply that it's stated that Celebrimbor gave the 15 rings to Sauron after the fall of Eregion. The only ones he didn't have with him were the 3 which he'd already sent away for safekeeping. The 16 were within the Gwaith Myrdain, and Celebrimbor was captured, tortured, and made to give them up to Sauron. But since the idea of both ways exists within the text, I guess it's another one of those situations where you can just go by whatever your preference is. However he got it, Durin III ended up with one of the rings of power. One of, as the poem goes, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone. The ring was passed down through the generations for thousands of years. The dwarves, of course, proving mostly resistant to the malevolent magic Sauron had imbued them with during their creation. But as we know, Khazad-dûm fell, became Moria, and Durin's folk relocated to Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, and the ring went there with them. The ring, magnified characteristics already there in the bearer, and this led to basically greed amongst the dwarves. During the time of Thror, Thorin's grandfather, Smaug descended on Erebor, attracted by the hoard and wealth of the dwarves there. Thror ended up passing his ring to his son Thrain, and then it gets a little bit more complicated. A lot of dwarves never actually knew what happened to that ring. Indeed, part of Balin's expedition to resettle Khazad-dûm was in part because they thought Thror's ring was still there. This is talked about at the Council of Elrond, where Gandalf explains to Gloin that he won't find it in Moria because Gandalf knows what happened to it. That Thror did indeed pass it to Thrain rather than still wearing it when he was killed in Moria by Azog. And that Thrain, unfortunately, on an ill-fated attempt to reclaim his homeland himself, was captured by Sauron, thrown into the dungeons of Dol Guldur, and forcefully had the ring stripped from him by Sauron. So that particular ring got back to Sauron. But it was only one of 3 that ever did actually make it back to Sauron that were given out to dwarves. The other 4 were destroyed or swallowed by dragons who descended upon the dwarves' hordes. And then, presumably, in the fall of Barad-dûr, it was destroyed along with, well, everything else Sauron had ever made. If it had somehow survived, though, with the destruction of the One Ring, it would have been rendered as merely a piece of jewelry, with all its power lost.